before you now to introduce and moderate our first panel, Christ-Centered Health, Past, Present, and Future. And just a word on how this will go. I will offer some brief remarks, introduce our speakers. Each speaker will come up and give a 15 to 20 minute talk. After both talks are done, I will start the Q&A up here, and then I will open it up to the audience for more questions. As I was preparing to moderate this session, I made it over to one of our speakers' posts that named her favorite books of 2024. I was pleasantly surprised to see The Good Virus on the list. We don't typically think of viruses as good, but as a virologist myself by training, these good virus entities called bacteriophages fascinate both me and my students. These phages are viruses that only infect bacteria, and they do so very specifically. You may be surprised to know that the vast majority of viral infections on Earth happen in the ocean, to bacteria. Some back-of-the-napkin calculations suggest that bacteriophages infect bacteria 1 times 10 to the 23rd times per second in the ocean, and remove 20 to 40% of the ocean's bacteria per day. There's evidence that a potential treatment for antibiotic-resistant bacteria could involve harnessing the power of these phages to kill very specific bacterial strains without harming the host, obviating the need for more drugs. That's the technique side of medicine. We rightly marvel at the awesome nature of these agents, as well as the ability to potentially use them as medicine, as something to hopefully alleviate human suffering. We sometimes forget that there's a recipient of that medicine. What about the patient and the doctor's relationship with them? How have we as a society understood the patient in the past? How do we view them now? How will we view them in the future if we view them at all? Should treatment override or neglect personal experience? What about the role of expertise and whose expertise? These questions and more are what this iteration of the Portsmouth Institute's Summer Symposium aims to ask and start answering. Our first panel will make it abundantly clear, as did Dr. Holman last night, that medicine and healthcare have deep Christian roots, and that perhaps we've forgotten that fact along the way. How can we redeem how we care for others, fully acknowledging them as image bearers of our Creator, full of dignity, hope, weakness, and worthy of the utmost respect? Leah Libresco-Sargent is the author of 3 books. Her newest, The Dignity of Dependence, focuses on how the false idol of autonomy leaves us unprepared to know ourselves or God. This work will be available in the fall and can be ordered directly through the University of Notre Dame Press until the end of the month, using a code we can provide after the panel. Dr. Tommy Heyne is an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School and an attending physician at Mass General Hospital. He is a founding member of the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School and was recently ordained as a permanent deacon in the Archdiocese of Boston. We're in for a treat today as Tommy and Leah get us started, and thank you for joining us. Dr. Heyne, you're up.
Thank you so much. Well, if you have any coffee, it'll be all right, because we're going to head off to a pretty fast start here, going through aspergillosis to the rachitic rosary, medical terms with Christian Catholic roots. I have no conflicts of interest. So these are my learning objectives and my outline here. We're going to talk about the conflict thesis briefly, which is kind of the, I think, background for this entire symposium, and then delve into some medical terms in these 4 disciplines. And then we're going to, in so doing, summarize a little bit the role of the church in science. So I think we're all aware of this in this room. The background for this symposium and for there being science departments in Benedictine-run schools is that there's this conflict thesis, namely that the church or religion or Catholicism has opposed science for centuries and centuries, so progress is basically a standing way of progress. And this started really at the end of the 19th century, but it certainly had roots in the Enlightenment. And here you have some nice propaganda. So you can see sallying forth from this old medieval castle, various different clerics, including looks like a Franciscan to me, but said medieval dogmatism and banner says believe or be damned. And opposing them are these, very educated men using shining the light on this darkness with a modern Gatling gun that has written on it history, archaeology, lightning, geology, and down the ammunition is science and historical facts. And their banner is think or be damned. So this is, we're all chuckling, but this is how many people think today. And in fact, if you look at study after study or anecdote after anecdote, a major reason that people are staying away from church, for example, you get this 2022 Barna survey, that for non-believers taking the survey, the reason number 2 that was given for doubting Christianity is basically science. So this is what we deal with, I think, on a daily basis, those of us who straddle these two realms. So the reality, of course, is very different from this, and we're on the grounds of an institution that's doing this. You can read the memes on your own, but we know this, that this Coptic thesis was debunked maybe many decades ago, but many, especially the young, don't realize that. You go to YouTube, you go to these various different Reddit channels, and it's still, Galileo, blah, 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 that the church is obviously against science. So I think, again, starting this, today's events, sort of talking about what we need to educate. So I'm going to give you guys some ammunition in our gun, so to speak. So I'm speaking specifically as a physician and physician scientist and talk about medicine. And I could go many different routes to sort of make this point. I could talk historically about the church's contribution to the world's first public hospitals. For example, the Basiliad of St. Basil as this tocotropheon. You guys got a great taste of that last night with Dr. Holman. We could talk about the first universities and medical schools. Perhaps no better place to do that than the grounds of the Benedict Abbey. But Bologna, Oxford, and then the first medical school still running today, Montpellier, all with obviously Catholic roots. But I'm going to do something a little bit different, which is near and dear to my heart as a physician. These are terms that I use almost on a daily basis that have the roots in Catholic Christianity. I wanted to ask, are there any medical people in the audience? A few, great. And you guys all see the doctor, hopefully, so this is relevant to everyone. So, in so doing, hope to show a little bit that even the sort of the air we breathe within medicine is infused with Catholic Christianity. So here we go into these 4 disciplines. We're going to talk about micro-infectious disease, how to do that with Deacon Dr. Tim, another Deacon Doctor in the audience, with ID Doctor. So I'm going to encourage you to say, what do you think this is? Just shout it out and have some fun. What are these? Cells. Why are they called cells? Cellular. Well, because they look like monastic cells. That's what you're laughing at. That's what Robin Hood first looked. We looked at the cork cells. And, well, these look like these little square things that we know that monks live in, because of course they all knew monks. And these are the recently refurbished monastic cells here at Portsmouth. So cells, right? We talk about cells all the time. That's a monastic term. All right, this is a little bit more vague, but occasionally patients that Dr. Deacon Tim may have treated with AIDS who get this invasive fungal infection, aspergillosis. So this is a fungus ball. So this is a mold that can infect humans. And why is it called aspergillus? What's called aspergillum. So look at it under the microscope, and that's what it kind of looks like. So this priest, also a scientist, and in fact the father of mycology, lo and behold, here's a priest who's the father of mycology, and looked under the microscope, saw these conidiophores, and thought, that looks a lot like what we're using every Sunday. So there you go. Aspergillus comes from Catholic ritual practice. Okay, moving forward. This is relatively common in developed parts of the world. We don't see it, in developing parts of the world. We don't see it too commonly today. Yeah, related to, so tinea can cause wingworm. It's a type of fungus, but specifically the bug that causes this is Trichophthon tontrans. So why tontrans? Well, because it looks like a tonsure, right? The tonsure, there's different types of ways of cutting tonsure, but in medieval era and later, it looked like the crown of thorns. So tonsure, that comes from the word meaning to cut. But if we're going to talk about cutting, I have to throw this in. But so William of Ockham, who was a Franciscan, when he shaved, he used Ockham's razor. So Occam's razor, I think you guys use as philosophers. All I know is in medical school we talk about it a lot. So Occam's razor, the idea is the principle of parsimony. So you got this symptom and this symptom and this symptom. Well, there's this one simple diagnosis that can kind of bring it all together. So we talk about it. Occam's razor, he's a Franciscan, so it's pretty cool. This is a little bit more esoteric, but you got a little intracellular, so these red blood cells under the microscope, and you've got this thing that looks like a 4 is a tetrad, and Maltese cross. There you go, you keep your job. I think you just retired, so you can still teach. The Maltese cross. So this is an intracellular parasite for budding neurozoites, but that's babesiosis. So babesiosis, not quite as famous as Lyme, but caused by the same ticks in the same area. So check yourself for ticks if you guys are going in the woods later this afternoon, because it can cause babesiosis, which when it grows in red blood cells looks like that. Well, somebody thought that looked like the Maltese cross. Of course, that's, again, a Catholic thing. So the Hospital Order of St. John started a hospital in Jerusalem, and since then has done a lot of healthcare work, as many religious orders have throughout history. They're called the Knights of Malta because in many of these Muslim incursions, they push them all the way back to Malta. So, and here there's chapters of the Knights of Malta, the Dames of Malta, all over the place. We have one in the Boston area who go out and do great work with the homeless and so forth. So, and they run ambulances, and in fact, the Catholic Medical Association, just talking with somebody from the CMA, their logo has the Maltese cross in the background. So Maltese cross. Also, if you talk to a pathologist, they say, oh, the other thing the Maltese cross is for is this. So this is a different microscopic image of basically lipids of fat can look like this. And so that's what's called nephrotic syndrome. All right. We all lived through this 5 years ago. So quarantine. We use that term, where that's, again, a Catholic term, basically. So it comes from the Latin for 40, and why? Where did this come from? Well, basically, during the Middle Ages or later, they've kind of figured out, well, if you just let the sailors come right off from their latest journey, we're all going to get sick, so let's let them sort of stay in the boat for a while. How long? How about 40 days? 40 days sounds good. Well, why 40? Because we already have this history within the early church of, if you're basically, nowadays, absolve you, here's 2 Hail Marys. Back then, it's your 40 days of public penance until you can come back to church and receive communion. So a little bit more strict back then. And why 40? Well, because of the 40 days of Lent, and of course the 40 days Jesus in the wilderness. You could go all the way back to the 40 years in the desert. But the idea of 40 days obviously is a New Testament idea, and so the idea of a quarantine, not our idea to do it, but it is a Catholic term. All right, terms from pathology, now shifting. You know what this is? You're noticing these are people with children with darker skin, maybe living in Alaska or something, they get a lot of sunlight. Rickets. I heard that. It's rickets. So specifically, these bead-like looking things along the ribs are called the rickety rosary. So again, we don't see too much of that around here, but rickets is from vitamin D deficiency. So basically, it's like the bones are trying to grow, but they don't have the vitamin D to do it, so they're overcompensating, so to speak. So these beads are the costochondral swellings in the ribs, and notably, the word rosary, by the way, is bouquet of roses. So we like to tell our boys that it's like pray your Hail Mary, it's like giving a rose to Mama Mary. And the bead itself is just from Old English for prayer. So all these kind of fun hymnologies, but basically, oh, the beads in the rickety rosary. Oh yeah, I know those terms. Thank you very much. We're talking about rosaries. This is also a rosary. We talk about it. This is a rosary bead esophagus. So somebody's got spasm in their esophagus rather than letting things pass strictly by. It's causing these kind of bead-like prominences. So that's the rosary esophagus under an X-ray swelling, some dye that you can see under an X-ray. This next one, I don't think even Deacon Tim has seen in his West African travels. Thank goodness, we don't see this much anymore. But this girl's trying to just walk back and forth. And instead she's having this sort of serpiginous movements in her arms and legs. Dance to St. Vitus, wow, great. So here's cause of death in some old, record, because this definitely was afflicted people. The St. Vitus dance, also known as the St. Ioannis Chorea. Remember, the infant leapt in the womb, so John is associated with leaping and dancing. Also known as Synonyms Chorea, from the Christian name who sort of discovered this and sort of associated with it. So chorus is from Greek for dancing. And this is a complication of rheumatic fever, which itself is a complication of strep. So like strep throat, that's what we treat strep throat. All of the strains around here don't tend to cause rheumatic fever, so don't go running for the amoxicillin. So this is from St. Vitus. St. Vitus, there's various legends on these 4th century martyrs, but basically that he was in jail, he danced with angels. And there's all sorts of later things, you see Germans dancing around, perhaps encouraged by alcohol to do so, but he was associated with nervous diseases from the 6th century onwards, hence St. Vitus dance. Again, fortunately quite rare around here, but during Middle Ages and later, pollen, so you get this fungus that grows on rye, and this causes something called St. Anthony's fire, or ergotism. So ergot is like from this fungus, and it's basically you ingest the toxin made by it, so it's a mycotoxicosis, and it can cause gangrene. So basically gangrene is where you don't get blood flow and things fall off and die. Also causes hallucinations. Remember that mushrooms is a type of ergot as well. So thing that can make people quite sick. So it's called ergotism. Interestingly, this is also called St. Anthony's fire. Totally different disease caused by a bacteria, not a fungus, but also known as erysipelas or cellulitis. Strep pyogenes is the causing agent. Again, fire, like generating fire because it feels quite hot, it can cause a fever. So these are both St. Anthony's fire. To take a quick segue, say the person who discovered the causing agent for this is Louis Pasteur, is one of my heroes. So when he looked under the microscope, he thought they looked like little rosaries, which they kind of do if you break it up. Louis Pasteur, real amazing guy, devout Catholic. 4 of his 5 children died of childhood illnesses, as was not uncommon in those days. So he sort of dedicated his life to fighting infectious disease in children and otherwise. One of the things he did is with an assistant, but he basically went to a dog with rabies to isolate and that's the death sentence, even today, basically, unless you get the vaccine immediately after. Rabies is uncurable. So he's the one who developed the rabies vaccine, the anthrax vaccine, and to the enjoyment of many of us, whether it's milk or Benedictine ale, pasteurization, right? Huge. Pasteur, he's going to do it. So there you go, Church of Science. So St. Anthony's fire, you can look at this as our building codes when you spend way too many hours on this thing, but can be, again, these 2 different disease processes. And why is it called St. Anthony's fire? Well, this is a bit of a stretch, but basically St. Anthony of the Desert, who battled demons, who I think nowadays is probably like insurance companies, wait times, but you can interpret that artwork as you like. But he was attributed, of course, with many miraculous cures, both during his lifetime and after, as many of these holy men were, and including there was an outbreak of erysipelas in the 11th century, such that they founded a religious order to sort of like treat that. Hospitallers of St. Anthony, there's an Eisenham altarpiece by Grunewald that shows this, but I've cut it in the interest of time. So there's St. Anthony's fire, based on St. Anthony. This person is trying to bring their fingers down, but can't. There's like a palsy there. I don't know what this is. Yeah, it does look like a papal blessing. Exactly. So this is a median nerve palsy, or actually maybe an ulnar nerve palsy, depending on what you're trying to open or close here. But also known, again, taught in medical schools, in the most secular medical schools in the country, still call it the Pope's blessing or the hand of benediction. And there's, of course, some Trinitarian theology there. So Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the 2 natures of Christ. And it's in the Epic or EHR, so it's real. So there you go, Catholic Catholicism and medicine. You don't ever want to see this in a patient, but this is the patient's belly button or umbilicus pooching out. I don't know what this is. What? This is a Sister Mary Joseph nodule. So this is when the belly button is pooching out, and you can see there maybe in the CT scan that's like a belly full of cancer. So metastases from ovarian or gastric cancer is the most common agent. This is named after Sister Mary Joseph. So she was a Catholic nun who was a scrub nurse in the OR in the Mayo Clinic. So these nuns are the ones who basically helped start the Mayo Clinic with the Mayo brothers. And when she was there, basically she noted that she sort of cleaned the patient. Oh, there's a bump there. Last week there was a bump. So basically she said, she sort of described this, that she could predict if there's going to be a belly full of cancer or not. And of course, egotistical male doctors being what they are, he tried to take the credit for it. So he tried to like publish this as, oh, this is this pants belly umbilicus, whatever. Later, another surgeon said, no, she's the one who first came with that. So she got the eponym to this day. We call it the Sister Mary Joseph nodule, which is pretty cool. So she helped, again, establish the Mayo Clinic and the Catholic Hospital Association, which cares for 1 out of 6 hospitalized patients currently in the U.S. So a pretty remarkable one. Shifting now to anatomy. Okay, we're doing on time. Doing all right. So this is a dissected heart. This is an image of a heart. So this is the mitral valve, also known as the left AV valves. And why is it called a mitral valve? Because it looks a lot like a miter. So this is an ultrasound on the bottom, but you can kind of see that there's two flaps to it, just like the head of our dear Pope, but that's what a miter looks like. Now, if you get a damaged mitral valve, then you might need to replace it with a St. Jude valve. So this is obviously named after St. Jude Hospital, which founders Dan Thomas, a good Catholic who was having a hard time in life and went and prayed to St. Jude, patron saint of hopeless causes, and founded this amazing hospital that provides free care, and also developed this cool valve. So again, something we talk about a lot in medicine, the mitral valve, mitral valve, mitral valve. Well, that's like a bishop's mitre, and the St. Jude valve named after our own St. Jude. Shifting to therapeutics, I venture to say many of you have tried this even without realizing it. So this is bark that treats this. So this is quinine. But for many years, and you might still see this, although we don't talk about this every day, but Jesuit bark, also known as cardinal bark, so the Jesuits basically brought it back from the New World as a treatment for malaria, some quinine from the Chichona tree. But this is what goes in gin and tonic. Because when the British colonists went to India and they knew they had to take this tonic water, quinine in it, it tasted terrible, but if you add gin to it, some London dry gin, she's pretty good. So anyways, that's Jesuit bark for you. Some others just to talk about quickly, but St. John's wort, some people use as an herb. Good Samaritan laws to protect people like me from getting sued if one of you falls down right now and I need to do CPR. St. Louis encephalitis virus, obviously from St. Louis himself. My town, Boston, is named after St. Boltoff. So the Boston Protocol, for example, is used all the time for neonatal fever. And then something we don't see too often, but look up Lazarcide. It's like actually kind of freaky, but people who are brain dead have certain nerve impulses still that can kind of like move. Or the Lazarus phenomenon, people get like a second wind before they die. Just to round up with some other eponyms here, but the fallopian tube, the eustachian tube, the Stenson duck, you can keep going, but these are all named, the star means they're cleric. So actually, Bishop Stenton is also blessed. He also founded geology, by the way. These are all named after basically Catholic anatomists. Pascal, who did many, many things, including making a calculator and unit of pressure we still use today in medicine, Pascal. Valsalva, the science of Valsalva, these were all devout Catholics. The Valsalva maneuver. Laennec, one of my true heroes. So Laennec, for example, one time he was praying the rosary with his wife, and thrown from the carriage, and let's finish our rosary, and they kept on going along. So that's the kind of man he was. But so the stethoscope that we use all the time now is basically everyone thinks that poo-poos Catholic purity and modesty. The stethoscope is a result of that, because in the old days, the way that you listen to a patient, you put your head against their chest, you listen direct auscultation of your ear. Well, this young Laennec was called to the home of a buxom Parisian woman to auscultate if she might have pneumonia, and I thought, this is not going to go down well with my wife. He took up a roll of paper and realized, actually I can hear way better, so then he developed the stethoscope. Initially as a wooden tube, and now we've got it as more of a plastic thing. But, so the stethoscope is an invention of Catholic modesty. Morganini has lots of eponyms. He also had lots of religious children. Mendelian genetics, I think that's very well known that he was a monk. And Schwann cells is from this gentleman. So that's our blitz through. We're going to just round it out with the last little tour de force. Okay, so I've just talked about these terms of kind of showing that yes, there's clearly Catholicism is in the very blood of medicine, or the mitral valve, the heart of medicine, if you will. But you can just go through this. I want to just do this for the sake of coolness. But the father of embryology, modern human anatomy, mineralogy, natural history, accounting, crystallography, geology, apiculture disease, histology, comparative anatomy, modern pathology, modern philosophy, analytic geometry, aeronautics, acoustics, all Catholics. And devout Catholics, not many that we know today. Modern chemistry, mycology, genetics, bacteriology, dynamo, echolocation, Big Bang theory. And you see all these fathers, too many of them priests. The Gregorian calendar, where basically almost the entire world uses. The calculator, the first woman, those are all men, so sorry for the sort of inherent misogynism in that. But the first woman Nobel laureate in medicine and physiology was Cori, the Cori Sarko we talk about in medicine, that's her. And the first woman to receive a PhD in computer science was a nun. So, pretty impressive. And just to final thought is that obviously, so we know this for science, but I think as Dr. Coleman talked about last night, that it's not just the science, that we should be really the heart and the soul of medicine. So here you have the cold scientist here on the side, checking the pulse of this like very sick patient, but it's the nun, and this continues to be the case in many places, parts of the world, who's providing actually like the TLC, the tender loving care. Further reading, Gary Frederick has a couple great books that I recommend, and I'll let you just quickly look at that quote. This is actually a Boston doc who did the first kidney transplant and won a Nobel Prize for it. Good Catholic guy, Dr. Murray. All right, that concludes my half.
Well, that was enormously fun. I'm glad I got down to see all the slides. So if that was your introduction to the reason that there's no conflict at the heart of medicine and the faith, I'm going to be here to talk a little bit about the ways, a temporary conflict is being expressed now. And I'd like to borrow a little from an insight I first heard from Ryan Anderson at EPPC. He said that the history of the church's conflict with the world can kind of be charted in terms of what offends people about the church. Initially, it's the church's claims about who God is. Then as the Christian church grows and develops, its claims about who Christ is. Is he fully man and fully human? It's the Christological heresies that drive division, fear, reaction to the church. Then conflicts over what the church is, the Protestant Reformation. What authority do priests have? Is celibacy a good thing? Who has the authority to interpret the Bible, etc.? But in the present day, when secularism is on the rise, and for the most part, many of the people you may come into conflict with don't really care about the church's claims about God, Christ, or the church, what offends people most, or what surprises them most, sometimes attracts them, sometimes repels them, is the church's claims about who the human person is. And that tends to give the flashpoints of cultural conflict, because the church continues to make the same claim throughout history, but what in the deposit of truth shocks people changes with the times. And so here at this conference, what I want to really focus on is the way that in order for doctors to be good doctors, in order for medicine to truly see the human person, it has to have a positive account of what the human person is, not just a descriptive account. And it's something that medicine struggles with a lot these days, that there's a kind of assumption that neutrality means not making claims about the human person, and certainly not making teleological claims. But the more medicine tries to retreat to this defendable neutrality, the less it can do to fully serve people, and the more conflicts it gets drawn into without a way to fully resolve them. So I'm going to start with a very contemporary conflict and then broaden it out a little. But I'd say part of what happens here is that medicine runs into trouble when it doesn't know how to mediate between our desires for the body and the reality of the body. And this has come up most recently in a Supreme Court case that I've been getting up at, I've been up for a while with my kids. I've been refreshing SCOTUS blog eagerly at 10 a.m. to see how it turns out, and maybe it's going to come out next week, and if not, probably the week after. This is a case known as Skirmetti, and it's about Tennessee's ban on youth gender medicine. And I'm not going to dwell on all the constitutional law parts of this case, because this isn't a constitutional law conflict, but essentially what happened for this conference is Tennessee banned transition medicine for kids, puberty blockers, cross-gender hormones, and advocates sued, and sued specifically on the basis of sex discrimination. So the claim was, if a doctor would give some of these medicines to a natal male for precocious puberty, but wouldn't give them to a natal female to block her puberty, that's sex discrimination. And this led to some very strange parts of the oral argument that really captured my attention, because several of the justices who seemed more aligned with the plaintiffs were questioning the lawyer for the state and saying, well, look, this is plainly sex discrimination. Don't you agree that your law bans a doctor if a natal girl comes in and says, I'm starting to develop breasts and I don't want them, I want puberty blockers to not have these breasts, doesn't your law ban the doctor from doing that? And the attorney said basically yes. And they go, well, and isn't the doctor allowed, if a young boy comes in who's developing breasts, to give him blockers or treatment? They're like, no, what? And the justice is like, well, he doesn't want the breasts, so a doctor will just block them. Like, no, the doctor will not just do that. Like, if a natal boy comes in developing breasts, the doctor has some follow-up questions. Like, is not going to put the boy on puberty blockers, wants to run some panels, like, see why that's happening. Is he just gaining weight that is being expressed there and he doesn't really need any medicine, but just, possibly exercise or possibly a talk about his changing body? Does he have some kind of estrogen-producing tumor? In which case, we really don't want to just block estrogen. We want to find the tumor. We don't just give people drugs for that. We ask questions. We make a diagnosis. And this kept coming up because, again, the justices kind of couldn't wrap their heads around not just a disagreement about claims about trans identity, but the idea that doctors weren't vending machines for their patients. The other example that came up, well, if a natal girl comes in and wants testosterone to make her voice deeper, you're not letting her have that. No. But if a boy comes in and says, my voice isn't deep enough, but he's allowed, no, he's not allowed to have testosterone just because he doesn't like where his voice is landing. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the times when the church winds up in conflict with the culture, it's that initial fault line that gets attention, but here it's revealing this different disagreement. Is a doctor there to help every patient's body conform to their desires? And now the state is unfairly carving out this one subset of trans-identified patients and excluding them from that service? Or is a doctor there to intermediate between the patient and their body? To figure out when a patient comes in expressing discomfort, are they revealing something to the doctor that can guide treatment? Are they misunderstanding their own body in such a way where the doctor is there to speak for their body and say, no, this is part of what your body is. It seems like you're not that tall. That's okay. You don't have to be that tall. It's not a medical crisis that you're not. So I'm not going to give you human growth hormone for being projected to be 5'4" male, even though that may make some parts of your life harder. Nothing is wrong here. It's just difficult for you. And we keep kind of running into that trouble where if medicine has a positive vision of the human person, it's possible for the doctor to speak for the body, to have a sense of what the body is aimed at, and to help a patient navigate what is pathology and what is difficult. But without that, with this kind of, intended to be fair neutrality, it's a lot harder for the doctor to mediate between these conflicting desires and embodied reality. And in fact, as we notice, that neutrality often doesn't stay very neutral. The Scaramanti case is about a very particular and fringe facet of conflict over gender, the gendered human body. But I think we see broadly that medicine often treats those conflicting desires for the body and reality of the body as though desires should prevail, and it's kind of the body's fault for not going along. And we see this very strongly in the kind of falsely neutral stance medicine takes towards the female body. I think it's common in both medicine and in social practice to not adopt a view of the human person as male and female as he created them, but as generically, broadly, inclusively human. But when you take human as the norm, gender unspecified, I think what happens in practice often is that what is viewed as the neutral human is mostly the male human, and then the female human is the odd exception or deviant. This is particularly strongly true in medicine where, as much as I appreciate many of those breakthroughs, when we come to, modern day clinical trials, a lot of medicine was practiced and explored primarily on the male body, partly for good motives, that you don't want to expose women who may be pregnant to drugs that may be bad for their baby, but you wind up in a world where there are more commonly side effects for women taking drugs that were tested primarily on men, or improper dosage calibrations, when you set the standard dosage for a standard human being, and I think, just looking around the room, even of the small non-random sample, we can see men and women are not exactly the same size. I do a lot of dosing by size, because I have, preschoolers where I do it by weight. But when it comes to adults, we don't dose by size, and we certainly don't tend to dose by hormonal balance, which can affect how many medicines are metabolized and taken up in the body. So women are often excluded from the medical normal because out of scrupulous fairness, the medical normal wants to focus on the neutral human, not customizing for men and women. And where I think we see this very strongly, unfortunately, is that women's bodies can be presumed in medicine to be defective from the start. And you see this most strongly, I think, when it comes to women's fertility. Male fertility is viewed as the norm. Someone who cannot, thankfully, be pregnant at any time. And then medicine tends to look at women as people who, strangely, can be pregnant, unfortunately, but ideally should be infertile with respect to pregnancy by default, and only, regain this capacity for fertility when it's specifically turned on or opted into. but a lot of the assumptions of how we treat and medicalize women assume that that switch should be flipped to off. And the more that you start with this sense that the neutral body is a male, non-pregnant body, that many women are frequently breaking that norm, and isn't that terrible for them, the more kinds of interventions are justified to return women to normal, whether that's taking a daily pill or using a vacuum cannula to remove the abnormal growth that deviates from our expectations of women as untouched and unmediated by the relationship to a growing baby. It's not a neutral stance, but because it's framed as neutral, as non-teleological, it's just descriptive. By default, people are not pregnant. Therefore, pregnancy is plausibly an illness, a pathology, a break from the norm. We wind up disfiguring the human person, both at the very smallest scale of the unborn baby, and in not telling the truth about who women are and making space for the gift of fertility throughout life. But there's another error that touches everyone in this room. Not just people with conflict over gender, not just women who may feel like the whole world has a conflict with their gender, but all of us, where medicine has trouble speaking with a full voice about who the human person is. And I would say that this is all of our discomfort, and the medicines as well, with who the human person is as someone who is subject to infirmity, dependence, and death. Medicine is most comfortable intermediating between the body and the desires when the desires can win. And the desire for health is not a pathological desire, but it's one that all of us know, or should know, will not and cannot win out in the end. So any account of medicine, of the human person, has to have room for what it means to care for and treat someone who is dying. There's something I find particularly troubling about the language we use often around cancer diagnosis and treatment. Oh, so-and-so is a fighter, so-and-so is a warrior, they're beating back this round. It's all fun and games and triumphant, like at each stage until you lose, right? That language of the war against disease in the body cannot be held to the end. So-and-so was so brave, such a warrior, but then they really lost it in the fourth quarter. Like we dropped the language at the very end because it's obviously inappropriate at a funeral. But it's also inappropriate, in that whole first quarter when we don't know how the game will turn out and we're not adequately preparing the patient or their family for the possibility of loss. And when I say the possibility of loss, I'm really still, myself, misspeaking and being too delicate. The certainty of loss. Because all of us, as long as the Messiah tarry, will die. We just don't know of what. And a practice of medicine that's uncomfortable with the reality of the human body as oriented to death and only after death to full and abundant life will dodge, blink, cringe away from fully recognizing and treating the human person in front of it. There's a wonderful quote by St. John Henry Newman that I like for really providing an alternative vision of what we do with the fact of our frailty, of our dependence, of our weakness, which I think it's natural for doctors who so often want to serve their patient by making them stronger to view as a professional pain, a genuine pain, that they can't do more for a patient and then, in worst cases, come to resent the patient for not living up to the potential of the treatment. But what St. John Henry Newman says is, we cannot be our own masters. We are God's property by creation, by redemption, by regeneration. He has a triple claim upon us. Is it not our happiness thus to view the matter? Is it any happiness or any comfort to consider that we are our own? It may be thought so by the young and prosperous, but as time goes on, they, as all men, will find that independence was not made for man, that it is an unnatural state, that may do for a while, but will not carry us safely on to the end. No, we are creatures, and as being such, we have two duties: to be resigned and to be thankful. And I think both of these are often absent in the practice of medicine. Understandably so, because without that teleological account of the human body, without that positive view of the body and of the human person, it's easy to see every medical setback as purely loss, and purely a falling out of what it means to be normal. which again, in our culture means slightly male-tilted, but young, healthy, without anyone else who depends on you. We see that most strongly in the hostility to pregnancy, and we see our laws aimed at it, but it's embodied too in that sense that when your parents become old, something bad is happening to their children. Not only bad, but kind of unexpected and unjust, right? We see this increasing suspicion of the normal, expected process of dying that for all of us will involve some amount of debility and embarrassment, unless we are so lucky as to be hit by a bus when we're 40. And I think it's odd to have a framing of medicine that views that as the ideal death, to die when your children are young, but to die with no part of your body impeded and to die very quickly. When we look at how we handle dying, it's often as though we're creating that counter image of being cut down suddenly in your prime as the ideal end to the human life, if we so have a horror of the natural end. And what we see increasingly, especially in our neighbors to the north in Canada, is this tendency to treat dying and aging as though it's something sort of like fertility and puberty, this embarrassing excess of bodiliness that we have to, as doctors, as friends, as individuals, find a way to contain, to regularize and standardize as much as possible so that our bodies don't betray us by being bodies. We see this most strongly in the increasing uptake and promotion of medical aid in dying, which is, of course, medical control of and overriding of dying. And you can make practical arguments against it. Currently in New York, there's a bill waiting for the governor's signature, which is anticipated to arrive soon, that allows medical aid in dying and allows it on a same-day basis. So you could receive a frightening diagnosis that sounds like it carries a very difficult manner of dying, not be experiencing that as of yet, but a terminal diagnosis, and request and receive death the same day, before you talk to your family, before you get a second opinion from a doctor. I think it's important to make the practical and procedural objections, especially as they kind of lay caltrops in the path of these laws. But I think we cannot win in this conflict without adding to these kind of practical procedural objections the real positive vision of what death is for, what Newman saw death is for, as a reminder of what our whole lives are oriented towards, the goal of dying in friendship with God, knowing ourselves as His creature our whole lives, holding on to that sense of our own frailty, including in our moments of youth, vigor, and strength, because even in those moments we're deeply touched by our moral frailty, which is much more dangerous to us than physical sickness. So that for our whole lives, we can know ourselves as valuable persons whose bodies are given to us as a cross by which we may know Christ. And when a patient comes to see a doctor, they come because they are in that moment deeply aware of their own dependency and frailty, though they may not know on whom they depend. So to some extent, every doctor, especially every Catholic doctor, should see themselves as one of the faces of Christ, who is there, to salve the wound as best they can, but most of all to love the patient and to make sure that it's clear that the patient's weakness is not an impediment to their love, or something that the doctor wishes to utterly dispense with so that the patient can be restored to being lovable. I think many people in medicine do this profoundly well, I'd say, especially nurses who are most often in direct contact with all the bodily effluvia that we all find so humiliating. And then in those moments are simply not shocked, I think is part of their witness, that this is part of being a human being. This is what a human being looks like at certain times, and it isn't as shocking to them as it is to us. But I think fundamentally a great deal of our conflict in the coming years will be offering a counter-catechesis of what a human being is and what the human body is for. It isn't a faulty collection of parts to be transcended, as Silicon Valley would have it, whether through bionic implants, merging with the machine mind, or simply seizing the time and manner of our own death. The body is something to be born throughout life and embraced as a cross, and then ultimately to be transfigured, limbed with glory by the one who loves us and who made a gift to us of his own wounds. Thank you.
Okay, many microphones. So I'll get started with a couple questions. Thank you both for those words. I guess I'll start sort of focusing on Tommy's, but you give us a list, right, of these terms that have Christian Catholic influence, right? And they're still used, right? So why does that matter? Some feedback here. Why does that matter? And what have we lost by sort of divorcing ourselves from their origin, right? It's because words mean things. It's important what we call things. In your experience, have you seen any loss of that historical grounding in how we mean things? And what can we regain by revisiting that?
So, how to say the sort of genesis of this talk, frankly, was as a medical student. I don't know if it was mitral valve or one of these terms. I figure out where to go here, but one of these terms sort of struck me. Oh, that's interesting. And then on the flip side, having one or more professors who, basically did one of these sort of typical conflict thesis type of things. Oh, wait, we talk about anatomy, and the growth of anatomy really didn't take off until essentially, because the church was prohibiting X, Y, and Z until modern era, blah, blah, blah. And I had to go and do my research and think, no, that's totally bonkers. So basically, as a student, it took, sort of my own research to realize, yes, there's this sort of hidden treasure trove of the, origins of medicine being, at least in strong part of it, Catholic. To try to get your question, I think the average Harvard medical student, I won't speak for my own, I never speak for my own institution, of course, but speak for any, big institution, they have no idea, and what's the mitral valve and so forth. So I think for myself, it's, I've given similar talks as this in different non-Christian, non-Catholic environments. So I think, look, I'm here to try to love a God and love neighbor and try to bring people to know Christ and to bring them to heaven. So the more that I, as one of Christ's children, can try to help people to realize that the church is a beautiful instrument that can help with that, I think the better. So I think for myself, this is just one avenue to maybe open an eye, open an ear that maybe was closed, that in fact you're using terms, you know where that's from. So I can't say I've done it on ground. So you know where mitral valve is from. Oh, it's from Bishop's. You should go read up on your, whatever, John Henry Newman. No, but it's sort of in these. It's how to describe. It's the counter-Catholic, I suppose.
Yeah, I think this is part of what's very beautiful about the history of medicine broadly, as well as the history of distinctively Catholic medicine. It really establishes that doctors have always practiced in relation to the body and in relation to particular human bodies. I love The Good Virus, and another book I love in the history of medicine that I didn't read last year, so it's not on the list, is one called, it's called Microbe Hunters by, I think, Paul van der Kruif. And it's the history of Pasteur and others, and you see, at this point in life, we kind of accept lots of these treatments, infusions, vaccines, etc., as standardized, that they all came off a factory line with no human hand or human intellect involved. And you see how hard won these insights were, how exploratory, how many blind alleys, and I think it makes both the treatments we do have feel like more of a triumphant, shocking victory, but it reminds you that each doctor, each researcher, including the one in front of you, is grappling with a mystery. You're using the best tools he or she has to hand, requiring your cooperation as patient to kind of narrate what they cannot perceive by their instruments, but always profoundly relational, not just having tools to make a body do what we want it to do.
Thank you. I think this is a good opportunity where we have a doctor and a patient, right? And you were saying after you read The Good Virus, you were sort of right before that you were going down to staph infection, and you were like, just give me the viruses, like as a thing. Could you give examples using your idea of a positive vision from the patient side, either an experience where you've been shown that positive vision, or what it would look like to you, and then tell me from your end how you've incorporated that concept in your treatment.
I'm not going to narrate the full story of my staph infection because it's extremely gross, so you can just trust me on that one. Anything you can do about that? Thank you. Let's see. I think it's been primarily for me through treatment I've received or received very badly for infertility and miscarriage, where I've had doctors, some of whom I stopped seeing, who had a full range of reactions from, doctors who, the moment they confirmed that my baby had died, stopped talking about my baby as a baby immediately. And they're willing to do that up till that point. Oh, here's the baby. That's their head. And then, the thing we thought was happening has happened. It looks like you've expelled the pregnancy, which was just additional pain in the midst of a very painful experience. Not how doctors tend to talk when you lose a child they can see as a body. It'd be strange to stand next to the body of a 2-year-old and say, it seems this is a body, right? Or tissue. The tissue is here. And it felt like it had to come from both a profound discomfort with death, which I think is strange in an OB's office. We think of that as a primarily joyful and life-giving practice, but about a quarter of pregnancies end in miscarriage, and they seem profoundly unprepared for that reality, as though oncologists were every day surprised they had to give terminal diagnoses. And I would contrast that with the NAPRO doctor I saw, who both helped look at root causes, but more than that, was really straightforward, showed me a whole flowchart of what she could and couldn't treat. That it was possible she would uncover causes she had nothing she could do for. And simply prayed for us and put all the names of children we lost into my chart, so it wasn't just pregnancy 1, pregnancy 2, etc. And I think that's really the gap, right? A doctor who, faced with her own failure to some extent, simply wanted to move on and wanted me to leave as quickly as possible. And a doctor who was upfront about the fact that she was not God from the start and brought God into her practice.
It's hard. I will say, medical schools, secular and otherwise, do their best to sort of instill empathy and, teaching. Medical students tend to be pretty good at it. They go in there with these bright smiling faces and, appropriately, that sounds hard and so forth. But, there's busy schedules and how to describe it. It gets more challenging as you go along, I think. Not to get, you get ground down by the many difficult hours in residency, and then afterwards, and this is your schedule, and this is how long you have for each patient. It's very difficult different than it was in medical school. So I pretend to be no expert at it, because what you're getting at is how do you treat the patient in front of you as Christ, both as Christ would treat them and as another Christ, in the least of these, and that with as much love, and treating them as a full patient, and not just a bunch of lab values or wanton diagnosis or what have you. So I pretend to be no expert at it, but I think a couple of things. So one is, leaning into the spiritual a little bit, which as Catholics we're not taught to do, and we don't feel comfortable doing, and it's actually, I did medical school in Dallas, and I learned from many Protestant colleagues there, sort of offering to pray with patients and this sort of thing, which, again, another talk for another conference if you like, sort of what I learned from there. But, I will not, so I'm an inpatient, my wife and I are both inpatient physicians, so if I'm admitting a patient to the hospital, you kind of try to suss them out a little bit and what the situation is. But, I'm asking what's going on in your life and all these symptoms, and do you smoke, do you drink, and where you live, and do you have any, do you belong to a particular religious group? Would you like a chaplain to come visit you? Sometimes they'll say, two of my sisters are nuns, or I'm a deacon, or, kind of throw some, and the idea being that, or would you like me to, is it okay if I, because we're in New England, so in Texas you offer to pray for the patient. Oh, please, yes, doctor. Here but I've never had a patient, well, it's okay when I leave, I like to pray for my patients when I'm at home. No one says no to that. In a world in which patients are increasingly treated as numbers, whether by insurance companies or physicians or everyone else, The idea that a physician is praying for you, kind of bringing you home with them, I think is well received. There certainly is a patient, so I think there's a way to incorporate it within, maybe not for every single patient, but lean into the spiritual a little bit. Don't be sort of shy. You can ask permission and so forth. But similarly, the times in which I've offered to pray with the patient, Heavenly Father, we're here with your son, John, and he's really suffering with the heart. We ask you to put your healing hand on him and help his family here. And we just, that's powerful, when tears are shed. The Holy Spirit works through that. So, and someone here is with the Catholic Medical Association. So there's groups nationally that are trying to sort of, because that's not part of your medical training whatsoever, but try to, empower physicians or other healthcare providers to do that. So that's one. And then two, I'd say, even outside of leaning to the spiritual, how do you treat each as a person? And you do your best to dig deep in your empathy. And it helps if it's something that you've suffered from, or your family member has, you're currently going through, or whatever, because then you get, that's terrible, I'm so sorry you had to experience a miscarriage, I blah, 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 it's happened with our family, blah, blah, blah. So, I don't know, but they all take time, and they all take patience, and they all, take some amount of selflessness. So, pray for us, it's hard.
At this point, I'd like to open it up to the room. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll deliver you a mic.
My pastor always says that science and religion are dance partners, not in opposition to one another. But I have heard recently, say in the past year or two, is that early Christians often distinguished themselves because outside of Rome, inside Rome, if you had a baby, for whatever reason you didn't want it, you just toss it over the wall, probably in the night so some people couldn't see you. And there were Christians outside who would take care of the babies that survived the fall. Is this true?
So, in another life, I did a master's in early church history and focused on medicine and with the early church fathers. But we have Dr. Holman here as well. But I've not heard, certainly the Romans practiced, infanticide of various forms. So if the idea is you've got a defective child and you just sort of leave them out, sort of expose the child because they didn't look exactly what the product from the other is talking about. But throwing over the side of the wall, somebody's got their hand up.
A citation out there.
Well, so there's a
Two mics. Here you go.
there's a hospital right next to St. Peter's. It's called Santo Spiritu. It's about 800 years old. And Pope Innocent III heard that pregnant women who were poor were throwing their babies into the Tiber River, and he was horrified at this. And so that's the first hospital where they had one of those turnstiles where the poor innocent made that be there, and the women it was announced in Rome, and they could go there and now you can, take your baby to the fire department or something, but it started at Santo Spiritu, and you could put your baby in this turnstile, and there were nuns back there who were nurses who would take the baby. And that, if you go to Rome, it's very near St. Peter's. It's not working anymore, but you can see the original turnstile in the wall, and so.
And that was in the 9th century, Innocent the Third. I think it was Innocent the Third. That would be like 1200.
Even later, yeah.
Yeah.
If I may, just a follow-up question. Is there a book that you would recommend on the early church history and science and support of science?
I mean, the two Gary Furman works are quite good. So science and medicine, and I think religion and science or something like this. But find me afterwards. I've got a few recommendations. The other thing, just to, again, this is a horn I like to toot, but to the point of, basically leaving, a child you can't care for. So if you go to Florence, Italy, similar thing, Foundling Hospital, where they've got you can still see the turnstile. Well, it's great also, so that piazza, which is quite famous, has these medallions of babies, and they're actually the Christ child in various iterations. That's the emblem of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Is one of those emblems. It's a child that was swallowed up. AAP has gone very far from that recently, but the point is, historically, it's our emblem. It's a Catholic emblem.
And one thing I would add is that we have the testimony of one of the very early letters from the early church, the letter to Mathletes, I think, where it's talking about just how strange Christians are, how they're marked out as foreigners everywhere they go. And one of the things that marks them out as foreigners, it says, they share their table, but not their wives. And they do not expose their children. And that this marked the church from a very early stage as odd. And I add to that practice of exposure that when we think about the examples of baby turnstiles, the foundling doors that are at some firehouse today, those are mostly for children who are wanted and loved, but parents are unsure how to raise them, right? And want to give them a proper home. They know who a baby is, right? That's why they bring them there. And the practice of abandoning a child that you simply cannot care for and fear the responsibility is different than the Roman practice very early on, which viewed it as a positive duty to abandon a disabled or congenitally abnormal child. And I think what we're seeing now is the repaganization of society, where there's more of a sense not only of the option, but of the duty to destroy the disabled or the different. You see it in the very high abortion rates for Down syndrome babies, which is a kind of exposure before birth. But you also see it in the reasons that people seek medical aid and dying. Oregon keeps pretty good numbers on this, or Washington keeps pretty good numbers on it in the US. And the experience of pain is cited a lot less frequency than the fear of being a burden as a reason to seek doctor-assisted suicide. So we're seeing those Roman attitudes come back out. And again, kind of only the church standing very strongly and saying the fact that you will need a great deal from your family is not a reason for them to kill you or for you to kill yourself.
Thank you both, such a really great panel. I think a lot of times when we as believers, Christian believers, or folks of deep faith, interface with the medical profession, you think that the people you're going to interface with will be hostile or against you. But yet there's, I think, much more frequently than that, and we see this with our medical students all the time, this, quote, neutrality. Effectively, the message is, check God at the door. We're not against God. Oh, God, that's good. Your God is good. That's all good. But don't bring up God here. Don't bring up a loving creator. Don't bring up an intimate loving God. But just don't talk about it. It's so interesting frequently when you're with medical professionals and you do bring it up and you find out that they also are very strong believers. But the ethic is not against faith, but to push faith out of the room, off the stage, as being totally irrelevant. It's maybe a settlement that's very different. The reason why this is so important is to emphasize just the witness. Not, and you all have experienced this, not so much that, well, the church believes in the sanctity of all life. No, just that, well, this is in God's hands. It's a very different approach. And we as Catholics are woefully bad at witnessing. And our Protestant brothers and sisters are so much better at it than we are. And we have so much to learn. As a man, it's not very comfortable to wear a crucifix, particularly at work. As a woman, it's very comfortable, and it's such a strong statement. It's quite remarkable. Every opportunity to witness, I mean, all of our consecrated religious who wear their Benedictine robes or their habits, even in places where it's a little uncomfortable, is such an extraordinary witness. So to really, for each of us to learn how to witness, and this is done in prayer and always in charity and with the Holy Spirit, but it is woefully uncomfortable. One of the Focus missionaries one time turned to me and said, well, you know, Tim, sometimes you have to be uncomfortable for Christ. And I was like, whoa, that's a really good term. So we have to learn to do it, because we all say, oh, you know, a great, easy, clean martyrdom that doesn't hurt. Well, that would be kind of, you know, amazing. But to be uncomfortable, I don't want to be uncomfortable. So how to learn how to witness in the caregiving professions is really the key. And I agree with you, Leah, you know, there are going to be a lot of nurses in heaven because they witness because their heart is right there and that they just give of themselves in that regard. And we physicians have a lot more trouble doing that. So any tips on how you witness and how that comes out as a patient and as a physician?
I'll give one for lay people and then I'll pass it off to you. I just think the helpful question to ask yourself is, in every day of your life, there's probably someone, more than one person you encounter who wants someone to pray for them and might want you to pray with them. And the question is, how hard are you making the Holy Spirit work to show you who that person is? Because he can do it, right? Like God can do it. There are various ways he can force you to realize that someone might need prayer. But I think the habit of the religious know how many people want someone to pray for them because you guys are wearing the spiritual equivalent of a kick-me sign, right? Like if people could bring both all their desires, all their anger, everything they feel about God and the church directly to you. And the challenge for us as lay people is how can we do that a little more? And I think one way of thinking about it, is even just manners of public prayer that allow someone to approach you even in a public place. There was a time when I was on the MTA heading up to New Haven and I wanted to pray the rosary and I was like, do I want to get my rosary out of my bag or do I want to just count on my fingers? And I did get my rosary out of my bag. And this guy sitting like catty corner to me on the train just was like, hey, is that a rosary? And I'm like, yeah, it's a rosary. And he said, will you pray for me? Like, I have cancer and my numbers on my last scan were bad. And I didn't know him, right? Like, he just was on the train and in his heart, he wanted someone to pray for him with him. And if I'd stuck to using my fingers instead of the physical rosary, he wouldn't have known I was up for it.
Beautiful. So as you're talking, Deacon Dr. Tim, I was thinking, Bishop Barron has become a huge, role model of mine in recent years. And so anything, listen to the Word on Fire podcast, books, etc. But one thing he talks about, which is so true within a doctor-patient relationship but in general in life is, we are very happy and reasonably comfortable talking about other very opinion-strong things. Politics, sports, to name two. I mean, within medicine, not infrequently, just to see if somebody's confused or not, you say, well, who's the current president of the United States? Okay, who's the president before him? And, you keep on going. And I'll tell you, even a patient who's like half delirious will tell you, well, I hate him. And depending on the era. Now it's getting more confusing because but so people will talk about politics gladly, vociferously sometimes. In some weird sports, I see you've got the Bruins game on, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I don't care. That's something they're passionate about. So why is it that people will gladly talk about, well, I hate the Red Sox, and blah, 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 knowing that you'll get, paper balls thrown at you, but to say, something about something that's your inner core, the most important thing in the universe, is, no, we don't do that when we talk about it. So just a way of reframing that thought. But I would direct people to, Bishop Barron, but also Brandon Vaught, who was kind of his right-hand scholarly man, did a lot of the podcasts with him for many years, but now is kind of publishing it. So he's got a couple, VOGT. But for example, the book Return, it's just called Return, like how to get your child back in the church or something. And he's also got like how to witness and what to say. So basically, as a former Protestant who became Catholic, Brandon Vaught brings some of that experience and these are great, for me, like very eye-opening books of like, because we're talking about a couple different things. One is these little, nudges. Here's a rosary. Here's do you want a chaplain to come visit you? Or, I noticed you've got a rosary there, ma'am. Oh, so we kind of have to have that conversation. But ultimately, what we love to do is bring people much deeper into relationship. And that might help, but those are just little nudges of deeper things. So that's kind of what Brandon Vaught talks about, that to, great, you could just do a little 2-second thing, but how to be prepared to say, oh, tell me, what was it like growing up? Oh, did you go to church? We talked about why? I'm just curious. Like those sort of asking those sorts of questions, we feel so uncomfortable about. And yet, we'll talk at the Thanksgiving table about whatever else is going on in politics, which is much worse. So I encourage you to, because that's a whole long thing, but I think Brandon Vaught has some really great stuff.
So I'm going to add one quote in there just because that's a good pitch for how necessary and how easy it can be, and I'm just going to make the acknowledgement that when you witness to someone, you are often asking them to blow up part of their life, and that's why it feels very hard. Like, I understand the Red Sox fans are very scary. A friend of mine wore a Yankees hat to a Red Sox game, and someone took it off his head and ripped a canvas hat in half with his bare hands. But when you witness in Christ, you're both sharing good news in the long term, and in the short term, you're asking someone to do something like acknowledge they will never be able to be remarried after, divorcing secularly, after validly contracting a marriage, and that their spouse will consider that an option open to them, and if they believe you about who God is and what marriage is, that option is off the table for them permanently. You are asking someone who has received a diagnosis of infertility that could be resolved with IVF, but genuinely does not have illicit treatment, to accept that they won't ever have biological children. You're asking someone near the end of life to accept that they will suffer more physically. I think it's good both to say that there's much we can do for people palliatively and not to sugarcoat the fact that dying is physically hard, right? That they will suffer a great deal, and you think it's possible to unite their suffering with Christ, but they've never done it before, and that's not part of something they ever considered possible. So, we really are always promising people the cross and Christ. And the cross looms larger and casts a very large shadow when you ask people to consider him. And I think that's because they've known the cross already in various parts of their life. Everyone knows what it is to suffer. It's a big leap of faith to think that there can be someone there in the suffering with you, and they know the suffering first before they recognize Christ within it.
We have time for one last question, a quick question.
Thank you. This has been phenomenal. May I just add something? The question originally had to do with why do we check our faith at the door when we enter the public square? And the answer to that is John Rawls, who taught at Harvard for years and published many books in which he argued not that there's no faith, not that there's no God, but in the public square, in a liberal regime, in order to preserve freedom and equality, you must check your theology, your philosophy, and your morality at the door. That's why the conversation always takes place with, well, that's very nice, but let's raise this to a different level. Pardon the pun on raise. I've spent the last 3 years of my life practically living in an assisted living facility because my husband is a resident. I also spent the last 15 years of my life in dioceses as staff of bishops. I witnessed during that time the closing of schools, the closing of the sale of Catholic hospitals in Boston and other places. Those kinds of things which the church felt forced to do, which bishops felt forced to do, have led us to a point where we don't have the normal, widespread resources to address these problems. Individuals who practice Catholicism, who have faith, still feel lost because their children are no longer practicing. My husband said to one of my kids just the other day, "Do you go to church?" And they do. But he was worried, he was concerned, because they don't, for the most part. This is part of that problem. As a staff of 2 bishops, I would recommend heartily, this conversation is a fabulous conversation, but part of that conversation has to be, Bishop, instead of closing schools, you really need to be opening schools. Now, I understand all the, financial and other issues with that. Instead of closing parishes, you need to be opening parishes. Jay Ziza and I are at St. John's Seminary. I just taught a propedeutic year with 13 students, and it's the biggest class I've ever taught. 4 Vietnamese, 2 Africans, several from Latin America, several former military, 1 Navy SEAL. Yes, you need priests, and you need parishes, and you need Catholic schools, and you need Catholic hospitals, because that conversation will never change until that happens. So my question is, how do you do that? And how do you help people in positions like I was in to say, please, I was sitting at the meeting when Cardinal Sean O'Malley made the decision to sell the Catholic hospitals, and you know the disaster that has occurred. So where does that support come from in the medical community, in the Catholic colleges, etc.?
I think the critique of roles is well said, and I think part of the answer of what the church needs to do is that naked public square is very thin gruel. Even people who embrace it as a principle that they hope to forestall major conflict don't find it very satisfying as a diet. It doesn't answer us well at the end of life in moments of crisis. You spend so much of your life living while not talking about philosophy or morals, right? And I think you see, as a real sign of hope, like more of an eruption of conflicts of philosophy and morals, both on the right and the left, as internal fights, where people are saying something like, wait, we spent a long time not talking about what our values are, and then we noticed we do not have the same ones, even within this political party, but we've lost the tools for having philosophical arguments. So there's a real hunger. I think what the church has to do is really strongly be the church, and not think the way to attract people is kind of toning down our message as much as possible until it's non-threatening, because someone who's drowning doesn't want a modest, non-threatening life preserver. My kids are going to a classical Catholic school in our parish, and our parish school, I think maybe 15 years ago now, was on the closure list. It was on the closure list with a lot of other schools in the diocese, and it was the only one that did not close. And it did not close because the principal did something incredibly generous and humble. He knew there were a lot of Catholic families in his parish who were homeschooling, and he gathered them together and he asked in a non-accusatory way, why don't you send your kids to my school? I genuinely want to know. And he said it in a way that they believed him, which is challenging once you've assembled everyone there to ask why you're not sending your kids and making the school close. And they said, well, the school isn't very good, Father. The academics aren't great, but more than that, it's just not very Catholic. And we can have a better Catholic education for our kids at home than we can in your school. That if it were really Catholic, would you send your kids? Not all of them said yes. Some of them really loved homeschooling for its own sake. But they revamped the school from top to bottom. And now the school is so oversubscribed that my 5-year-old has only gotten in on her 3rd year of applying after being waitlisted for 2 years, which was very frustrating to me. But I think this is really the opposite of Rawls' approach. It's not a watering down. It's not a thin neutrality. It's the church saying, we're going to give you real meat and real milk here. And my husband teaches at a semi-associated classical Catholic high school, and they warn the parents, because some parents want to come just because they read great books, and because there's no cell phones bell to bell, and that's attractive in itself. And by being a deeply human-focused institution, that school attracts people who are not Catholic. And the head of the school sits there and warns them at the information session, like, this is a Catholic school. Like, we have Mass, and every single class is taught from the point of view that Catholicism is true. And if you send your kids here and you're not Catholic, like, your kids may convert, and we will be happy if they do that, just to be clear. And this year when they did it, like, one set of parents got up and walked out. And that's fair, but it's good that he warned them, because every year some kids convert, and not all the parents are very happy about it. But it's good that going to a Catholic school, going to a fully Catholic hospital might put you in danger of being Catholic.
Obviously, a challenging question that even our best and brightest struggle with, but it seems to me it's both the top and the bottom in between. So many of our Catholic hospitals, as all the news, are just extremely poorly managed, including by people who wear the name of Catholic, and that's a shame on them, and may God have mercy on their souls, perhaps. But and whether it's religious orders with dwindling numbers or any number of things, but I do think that the data are out there. We're maybe at an inflection point where even though the number of people, we have the worst, Catholicism has the worst sort of leaving to entrance ratio of any religious denomination. It's like 6.5 to 1, so for everyone that comes in, 6.5 have left. But just in, I think the last year or two in the Pew Research polls, things have started getting better. An inflection point as far as the number of nuns unaffiliated is kind of leveled off. It's not accelerating anymore. And I was just at a mass with our new Archbishop Heyne, who says that every campus, basically the young person he's been to since he's been Archbishop last several months, is full to the brim, and like full as never been. And you mentioned the perpendicular. I think we're seeing this increasingly. I think that we and how many of us have non-Christian friends who are excited about Pope Leo? We don't imagine that a decade or two ago. So I think there's maybe something in the culture where they realize that the world of TikTok and pronouns and whatever is like maybe not where joy is found, and that there's something timeless and beautiful and good here. And I think a lot of great grassroots efforts of people like Focus and Word on Fire, groups that have really been, from the bottom up. So many answers to that, but I think it starts with each family and each one of us to do the best we can to be Christ to others.
All right, thank you everyone. We will take a short refreshment break, but let's thank Leah and Tommy for that.
So the next panel begins promptly at 10.
No, I was just out there to listen. Greece.